For this project, we're going to be using Alumilite Clear Cast. I've found it to be easy to use and actually pretty affordable. We'll need some colors. In this case, colors specifically for Alumilite. They're really strong, so we're going to have to be careful with them. We'll need mixing cups, 1 to 3 for each mix. Lots of mixing sticks, popsicle sticks, tons of them, and these tiny little toothpicks for mixing color. Some silicone molds for our pools of grossness. And then these are the magic items. These are resin bubble beads, and they're really what just makes this whole thing work. Alumilite's very easy to use. It is equal parts by volume, 2-part. The one thing to note about it is that it is sensitive to moisture. So you want to make sure that you're not introducing any water into this. A lot of people use acrylic colors for their tints. I think in larger volumes, when it's really distributed throughout a bigger volume of resin, that should work. But in these small quantities, I want to really make sure that I'm not going to run into any curing issues by using a water-based color. So that's why we're using the Alumilite. I know they will work. Now in this case, the yellow, these are strong, but because it's a lighter color and it is pretty transparent, I can use a fair amount, and it's my base color in both the smaller volume for the little mold and the larger volume for the large mold. Now, when we move on to the darker colors, the reds and the browns and the greens, I'm going to use very, very small quantities, just the tiniest dot. I'm just going to put a little bit of dot on it, and then I'm going to just gently swirl that into the color until it starts to lift off of the toothpick. And then I'm going to pause when I think I've got enough color off of the stick. The brown's even darker, it's even stronger, and so this is really just the tiniest touch, and I'm going to be really gentle bringing that into the swirl. I'm going for kind of a reddish, orangish, brownish, blood reddish color. I'm not really sure how successful I was. The red is a very primary red, so I definitely needed to sort of orange it up a little bit and warm it up as well. I'm gently swirling those colors in. I don't want it to be fully mixed. I want it to have some variation in the color in the pour. Now the key with this is the pour needs to be thin. 1/8 inch-ish, right? Not so thin that it's super brittle when it's done, but I need to make sure that I'm not going to need to fill these things up with beads. And so 1/8 inch allows it to be strong enough, but I can get 1 or 2 layers of beads and then they're sort of sitting on each other on top. And so that is a crucial thing. You don't want to make these too thick at all, because you'll just end up trying to dump more and more of your precious bubble beads into it to get them to sit on top. I'm starting with yellow for the bigger mold, and I'm mixing a little bit of brown in. This is going to be sort of my weird toxic slurry of grossness. And so it's this kind of gross, disgusting brownish yellow base. And when I pour it, I'm going to reserve a little bit of that resin back, because I want to mix some green into it to get sort of a two-tone thing going. You can do this and get a lot of variation in your color by mixing, pouring, keeping a little bit back, changing the color, pour, get a little bit more color variation, and use a single mix to create a lot of variety. Now, because it's so thin, it's not really pooling out and filling the silicone. The silicone's still sort of repelling it a little bit. If this were a thicker pour, that wouldn't be an issue. But in this case, it'll eventually I'll get enough volume in there that it'll all even out. And this does self-level very well. So open time is, you got a lot of time to really work with this material. It cures fully 24 hours, so sort of an overnight thing. Open times, I think a lot of it depends on your temperature and your workspace, but you got plenty of time to work this, so don't feel like you're really needing to rush it. This is not 5-minute epoxy by any stretch of the imagination. Once I've poured the green in the middle, I'm going to be really careful to swirl it, to sort of fill it. But the risk here is that I can actually overwork it and end up just flat out mixing it. And then that sort of defeats the whole purpose. So I probably should have had a little bit more yellow and a little less green. And then that would have allowed me to swirl the green in as the more sort of overpowering color and not have to worry so much about actually just mixing it all to a green. Now here's where the fun really begins. These resin beads are very, very interesting. They're super bouncy. And so at first I was like, I'm just going to pour it out of this thing. I realized that was a hugely bad idea. I'm glad I caught myself before I actually did it. And so I dumped it into a cup with a little bit of more flex to it so that I could really control where I'm putting these beads. They bounce all over the place and they have a tendency to sort of have a mind of their own. And once they're all over the place, they act like tiny microscopic ball bearings. So everything just starts to slide all over the place. If you try this, you're going to definitely notice that. They tend to want to just jump out of the mold. I don't know if it's the material or if it's static electricity, what it is, but it's pretty interesting. Now on the larger mold, because I didn't want to burn through a bunch of these, they're not expensive, but I didn't want to use my entire supply of bubble beads on one project. I'm really focusing on the edges. So the idea here is that there's something bubbling up from the center and it's just pushing all of the bubbles out to the edge of the pool. You'll notice that also the larger beads tend to they sort of sit on top in the cup. All of the smaller beads will sort of settle down in the bottom of the cup. The first things out of the chute are going to be the larger beads. So you want to kind of plan accordingly as you're sprinkling your beads in, that it's going to be the big ones out first. And then I'm using the smaller ones sort of like foam. Sort of that idea of the larger ones are bubbles, and then there's sort of this froth or foam with the finer ones. So they're actually, even though the fine ones don't have kind of the same pop, no pun intended, they definitely have a cool effect and they really add to the overall effect of the piece. Now, once everything's where I want it, I'm going to come back in and I'm going to just use a straw and use I guess my breath has some bubble popping abilities, but use my breath to blow on the surface to pop the real bubbles. You can use a torch, you can use a hot air gun, but straw's cheap. These need to be leveled so that they actually don't all sort of slosh to one side of the mold. In these little thin ones, it's not as big a deal, but when you're actually pouring big resin pours, it is important to level your molds while they cure. They will have a tendency to creep over time. 24 hours later, I just love this bubble level. They're ready to demold. They're going to cure for a little bit longer. They're not fully cured, but they're definitely cured enough to pull out. This effect is actually super cool, and they look great on the surface. The iridescence is really awesome, and they actually look super cool on the backside. So be thoughtful about how you might use this effect in both ways, both surface and sort of on that back side of the mold itself. The red one was okay. I think I was a little heavy on the bubble pour, but I think they work really well with the color, and I'll find a use for them. There you have it. I really hope this was helpful. If it was, please hit that like button and be sure to subscribe.